Well, here we are again, and we are going to talk about Spain today. So I don't know anything about paella, but we'll talk about Spain. And then after a glass of wine next week, I'm sure all of the connections will be perfectly clear. So what we want to do tonight, and I'm kind of excited because I've never actually taught this before. I've only taught little pieces of it. So it was really fun for me this week putting this together. And so Spain had a really different experience of the Reformation. In fact, it was a completely different experience than Luther's in Germany or Calvin's in Switzerland and France, or any of the folks in England or Scotland. Very, very different. And in fact, one historian has said that we're actually asking the question wrong. He said it's a bad question. We've posed this question badly. Basically, the question that we ask is, what caused the Reformation? And he says, actually, it's not a question of reforming the abuses of the church. Really, it's not a reform, but it's a question of a new period in the church, a new time. So people were searching for a more meaningful faith than the old church was able to offer. And so Reformation isn't, if it's the answer, we need to think about, well, what exactly are we asking? Is it what's wrong with the church? Or is it, how can the church better serve? How can people be more connected with their faith? And Spain is a great place to look at this, because Spain didn't have a Protestant Reformation, really. They had some heretics and some other folks, but they didn't have a lot of Protestants running around, at least what we would now call Protestants. So here's a map, and you'll recognize, we're going to talk about Ferdinand and Isabella, but you'll recognize there Castile and Leon, Granada, Portugal, Cordova. Toledo is right there. I want to point out where Toledo is. Do you see Castile and Leon? Right there under the ampersand? That's where Toledo is. It took me, I had to go to another map. I was like, Toledo must be on this map. So it's right under the ampersand. It's right smack in the middle. So Toledo's an important place at this time period, and of course in Spain as well. So before we get to the 16th and 17th century, which is where we're going tonight, I want to talk a little bit about the forerunners, what led up to this time period in Spain. And I'm not actually even sure, I'm going to want to keep saying the Reformation in Spain, and it would be wrong to say that. So we're clear that when I say that, I'm wrong. So I want to talk about what led up to this time period and all of the amazing things that did happen in Spain, just not the ones we're used to talking about in the Protestant church. We started this series, I started out with Erasmus and saying he was a person who was very interested in changing the church, in changing things, but he never left the Catholic Church. And so we're going to loop back to Erasmus, and I put up Erasmus of Rotterdam because I want to make sure we understand the connection between the Netherlands, or the Low Countries, and Spain. So at this time, remember, there's a Holy Roman Empire, a Holy Roman Emperor, and he is actually, at this time period, also the King of Spain. Now, if you're the Holy Roman Emperor at this time, you get on Wikipedia, if you look, it's this long, his titles. But one of them is King of Spain. But under his title of Holy Roman Emperor, he's also in charge of the Netherlands. And so there's even, during this time, up through the next couple 150 years, there's what we now know as, or think of as, the Spanish Netherlands. So we don't usually connect to these places because culturally and geographically and religiously now they are completely different. But at this time, they were in some senses together because they had the same ruler. Now, we didn't talk about the war in the Netherlands so much, except when the 30 Years' War ran over into it. But Spain and the Netherlands had their own version of war that went on and on and on, and we won't go into that. But I just want to point out that the Netherlands and Spain were very connected at this time period. And the Netherlands Spain wanted the Netherlands because they wanted England. So you remember the Armada that got defeated in the Channel. They had past tense, a great launching place from the coast of the Netherlands, and they lost it, and they lost the whole thing. So, war. There's also, we'll talk about Isabella and Ferdinand, the fall of Granada, Cardinal Jimenez, and the Holy Office, which was established in Spain. That's the nice way of talking about the Spanish Inquisition. And this is a new thing that was started in the 15th century to root out Muslims. So for hundreds of years, what we now call the Reconquista had been going on in Spain and Portugal. In, let me think, the 8th century, somewhere centuries earlier, Islamic forces had come across from North Africa and taken over this part of Europe. This was horrific. If you were a European anywhere in Europe, you were like, whoa, the barbarians are invading, and they're really close. They're one mountain range away. And so if any of you studied the Song of Roland in literature, that's about the early days of this Muslim European conflict that was taking place in Spain. So Europeans of one stripe or another had been trying to reconquer that peninsula for centuries. Finally, in 1492, which is another famous date, Granada fell. So let me go back to that map. Look where Granada is. It's way on the coast of the Mediterranean, right across the street from North Africa. So that was the last holdout on the peninsula. That was where Muslim rulers still ruled. And under Ferdinand and Isabella, Granada fell. And so this was a momentous occasion. Sultan Boabdil surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella. And you can see, this is actually, I think, a 19th century depiction of this event. But there he is on the left, and Ferdinand and Isabella, you can see both of them on their horses on the right. And the way that historians, or the story is told from the sources, is that he actually got off his horse and knelt in front of them to surrender, and his mother just about had a fit and said, you, basically in a very sexist 15th century way of putting things, basically you were acting like a woman, and you should not have bowed in front of those barbarians. So I mean, it was barbarians on both sides, right? So the fall of Granada was huge. Finally, Europe is Christian again, just in time for the Reformation. But this was a huge, huge event. Before the fall of Granada, people were concerned that to displace the Muslim inhabitants of the peninsula. So they were looking for them. And really, the Spanish Inquisition was begun to look for Muslims. And so it was exactly what it sounded like. It was people asking questions. And it was really scary because your neighbors could squeal on you, and then you get hauled up. There were some amazing people that we'll meet today, 2 saints now, full-on saints who got hauled before the Inquisition and almost lost their heads. So it was a frightening thing, and anybody could get hauled up before the Spanish Inquisition. But it was started to get rid of the Muslims, either to deport them or to convert them. After the fall of Granada, this was extended to Jews. So this is an ugly part of European history, one that burbles up over and over again in different places, what we would now call anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism. People didn't want Jews around. And so the Inquisition started going after Jewish folks on the peninsula as well. Many of them, as you can imagine, there was every response that was logical. Many of them converted. Some of them were full-on conversions to Christianity. Truly, yeah, this makes sense to me. I'll go this next step. Others said they converted, but were hidden Jews, so they had hidden synagogues where they worshiped. Some of them left, and some of them were killed. So it was still a very rough time in the lead up to the year 1500 in Spain with the Spanish Inquisition. And there's some I can't tell you about all of this today, but there's some fascinating, almost memoirs, letters and memoirs from Jews who left Spain, went to the Mediterranean, and then when they were with communities of Jews, were like, oh yes, I'm a Jew. And then they would move a little further. I'm thinking of your cruise around the Mediterranean. When they'd leave a Jewish part of the Mediterranean and get back to a Christian part, oh, nope, I'm a converso. I'm a convert. And so it's interesting because what we can see through some of these stories is that religion was not that important to some individuals. To some, yes, of course it was. So much so that people of all different faiths lost their lives because their faith was so important to them. But to others, it was like a jacket, or 2 or 3 jackets to take off and put on when the time called for it, when their safety was important, when it was at risk. So the fall of Granada and the beginning of the Inquisition were important lead-ups to what I'm going to call the Catholic Reform in Spain and Portugal and on the peninsula. And I want to tell you, I can't remember, did I tell you about Isabella's chaplain at the beginning? No, Ellie's saying no. Okay, we'll trust her. Queen Isabella, there she is on her horse, and Ferdinand both, but especially Isabella, was a very committed monarch. Very committed Catholic monarch. Her faith was extraordinarily important to her. And she had a man that she wanted to be her private confessor. His name was Francisco Jimenez. And he did not want to be Queen Isabella's private confessor because he was Franciscan. He had started out as just a regular priest, and then he had some sort of conversion experience, a turning, a personal experience. His heart was strangely warmed, like John Wesley's was last week. His heart was strangely warmed, and he became a Franciscan and gave up all of the perks that came with being a parish priest, and became a Franciscan, went into a community, led a life of very austere asceticism, and the last thing on the planet he wanted to do was go into the royal court and be the queen's confessor. I mean, this just reeked of having to wear nice clothes, right? But Isabella was so determined. So think of who she wants as her confessor. This is the kind of man she wants to come and be her private personal chaplain. She wants this very austere Franciscan. So she goes way over his head, way, way, way over his head, straight to the Pope. And the Pope says, Isabella, you want Jimenez? You got him. So he's stuck. He can't do anything except go and be Isabella's confessor. But he made a deal with her and said he had to still live in his community. He was not going to go and live at royal court and be all fancy schmancy. In fact, if you compare, we'll see an image later on of Ignatius of Loyola, but if you just compare his outfit, it's clear it's much more simple than it could have been. So the great thing about Jimenez was that he took advantage of his position in court and his access to power. And he started, he became the Archbishop of Toledo, there in the middle of the map. And he continued the reforms that he had experienced, that he wanted in his own order. So priests had to reside in their parishes. They could not, if their parish was in South LA, they could not live in San Marino. They had to go live in South LA. Sorry, that's where your people are. So that's where you need to be as well. So they also had to give up their concubines, which was very much practiced at this time. It wasn't, it was not the best thing, but it wasn't all that frowned upon. So they had to give up their concubines. The priests themselves had to go to confession regularly, preach the gospel, and instruct the young. So when he got to the preach the gospel and instruct the young part, he realized that not only did the priests not live in their parishes and have concubines, they didn't really know that much about the gospel. So he built schools. They didn't, bless their hearts. So he started building schools. He built several schools in the area of Toledo where Greek and Hebrew were taught. Now Greek I could get, and Latin, I'm sure they taught Latin too. But Greek and Latin, remember, we're in the Renaissance, we're going back to the sources. Everybody's learning Latin and Greek and going back to Aristotle and Plato and all those really towering intellects. So that was great. Not only Greek and Latin though, Hebrew. Hebrew, now think about Spain. We've gotten rid of all the Jews, or we're trying to, but also we've learned Hebrew from some of the rabbis. And so Spain, even in this way, becomes a very interesting place. And if you're interested in this, I didn't bring any of these books. This is not necessarily about the Reformation or the Counter-Reformation or Christianity even. But the history of that peninsula in Europe and the mixture of cultures that still takes place there, you see it in the mosaics in Spain, and the what's left of the Islamic art. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. And you don't have this coming together really hardly any place else in the world. But Hebrew was part of that. So he taught Hebrew. And he prepared, under his direction, there was prepared what's called the Complutensian Polyglot Bible. Now, Complutum is just simply the Latin name for Alcala, which was the town where the university was. How you get Complutum from Alcala, I have no idea. We can figure that out next week after the second glass of wine. But there were so many scholars there, they put together this, and I'll put this slide up at the break, you can come up and look at it. But what this is it's a kind of an interlinear translation, but it's got Greek, it's got Hebrew, it's got Latin, and Spanish. So all of the languages are there because he said, how can you learn about what Jesus said if you don't know what the Bible said in the original text? And so he sponsored this Bible, and it's very interesting. The dedication is to Pope Leo, and honestly, this just kills me, okay? So sit down, fasten your seatbelts. Pope Leo is Luther's pope. He's also the one that made Jimenez go be with Isabella. This is what Jimenez, in his dedication to Pope Leo, said about the Bible: that he was hopeful that the hitherto dormant study of the Holy Scripture may now at last begin to revive. The dormant study of the Holy Scripture may now at last begin to revive. Who does this sound like? It sounds like Luther. I have no reason to believe that maybe Jimenez heard of Luther. Certainly they did not sit down and have coffee together. They did not. And so you have to really wonder. Okay, you don't have to wonder. I'm just going to tell you what the answer is. Isn't it amazing what the Holy Spirit was doing? Everywhere. Revival of the study of the Scripture. It turned out differently in Spain, and we'll see how. But Scripture was very much an important part of the Catholic Reform in Spain as well. He had other books printed in Alcala, so it's not just copied by the monks. They had a printing press, just like they had in Germany. He printed a very famous Life of Christ that we'll hear about again in a minute. He printed some commentaries, and this one I have just for you, Lee. One of the first books was a book of rhetoric. So my husband teaches rhetoric. So printing presses and this whole culture of books was happening in Spain as well. So, I forgot to tell you, in addition to this Complutense and Polyglot Bible, in Spain at this time, the very first Greek New Testament was printed, ever. The very first Greek New Testament was printed in Spain at this time. I just think it's amazing. So these are some of the forerunners up to the year 1500. So let's just keep in mind where we are. 1515, Teresa of Avila is born. 1517, Luther pangs his 95 Theses into the door at Wittenberg. Teresa of Avila, we learned a little bit about last year. I said, when we talked about women of the Reformation, I said we can't say she's of the Reformation, but she is a Reformation woman. And we'll hear a little bit more about her later on. So right at this time, reformers of one kind or another are being born and beginning to work in Spain. And one of the most famous is, of course, Ignatius of Loyola. He, in 1521, he was born at the end of the 15th century, but in 1521, he was injured and converted. And so here he is. His name was not Ignatius, it was Inigo Lopez de Loyola. He took the name Ignatius later when he went to Rome. They think because of St. Ignatius of Antioch, but his name was Inigo. And I have to tell you, this is really how we need to think of St. Ignatius at his beginning. And who's seen the movie The Princess Bride? Okay, great. Okay, you know the guy? You know what I'm gonna say? My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. This is what you can imagine this Loyola saying. My name is Inigo Lopez de Loyola. I am a fighter. Prepare to die. He was a caballero. He was like one of the three musketeers before there was muskets and 100 years earlier. He was a dashing Spanish noble soldier. Could he care less about the gospel? Probably. He probably could have. He had no interest whatsoever in doing anything except fighting and being a dashing young noble soldier. But what happened was, oops, we're not there yet. We'll stick with Inigo for a minute. He fought for his king, who was the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, against the King of France in 1521 at the Battle of Pamplona. And he took a cannonball in his leg. Now, as you might imagine, yes, I heard somebody say, oh, yes, this would put a crimp in your style if you were a dashing young Spanish noble soldier. And it did. I think, honestly, amazingly, lived. They took him back home to recuperate. Now, in spite of his injuries and in spite of the surgeries that he had to have, imagine surgery in 1521. Not just one surgery, a couple surgeries just to get his leg kind of straight and healed. Well, wouldn't you know, after it was straight and healed, well, it was still a couple inches shorter. That was a problem. But the real problem was one of his bones that was supposed to be underneath his knee, it was kind of like sticking out. It was under the skin, but it bulged. He had a bulge. Now think about men's fashion at this time. They wear tights. This was not becoming. And Inigo thought, this can't be. So he said to the doctors, can you do anything? How can I go out and be dashing with this bulge in my knee? And they said, well, we could do another surgery, but it would be really more painful than the first one. And you don't need it. So he's having elective cosmetic surgery, right? He's like, nope, can't have this bulge. So he had another surgery, amazingly. And apparently it really was dreadful. And in his recovery, he was bored. He had to stay in bed because he still couldn't stand on the leg. It was prettier, but he couldn't stand on it. So he stayed in bed, and being Inigo Lopez de Loyola, he said, I want some chivalrous romances to read, okay? Because I've got my eye on this girl, and I'm kind of daydreaming about her, and I need some romances to go along with this. We don't actually know who the girl is, but they think that maybe it was the king's sister, who would have been completely out of reach, even though he was dashing and noble. So, unfortunately, as it turned out, they didn't have any chivalrous romances at his castle. So what did they give him? They gave him the Life of Christ that Cardinal Jimenez had printed, along with some saint stories. And so, because he was stuck in bed, he read the Life of Christ and these saint stories. And it was the funniest thing, Inigo said to himself. He realized that when he was thinking about those chivalrous, daydreaming about his princess, that it was exciting while he was thinking it, but afterwards he just really wasn't that happy. He wasn't content. It left him discontent. But when he realized he was reading about Jesus and the lives of the saints, he was happy both when he was reading them and after it was over. And so he promised God that he would no longer be a soldier for the King of Spain. He would be a soldier for Christ. And he would do the kinds of things, these amazing deeds that the saints had done and that Jesus himself had done. And so he wanted to go to Jerusalem, because this was what anyone whose heart was strangely warmed at this period of time took the cross and went to Jerusalem as a pilgrim. And he did. But first he walked all this way. So you see where Loyola is. This is way up close to France, which makes sense why he was fighting the King of France. He walked, it's over 300 miles, I read somewhere, all the way to Montserrat, which is just outside of Barcelona. It's a famous monastery that's there. He stayed there with the monks for a while. And you can see the kind of terrain that he had to hike through on his way to Montserrat. Really, really remarkable. And then he actually did go to Jerusalem, and we'll see what happened to him in Jerusalem. But first, I want to just compare these two guys. His story really, except for the chivalrous romances and the "My name is Inigo de Montoya," his story is not that different from Luther's. He had a crisis, he came to faith, and he wanted to do something different afterwards. But instead of going against the church, Ignatius went to the church. He embraced the church completely, fully. Why? I couldn't find a book that said, why did Ignatius, stay in the church and Luther didn't? But here's what I think. I think it had to do with Spain itself, and his context, both culturally and geographically. I mean, think, he has known these amazingly committed Roman Catholic rulers, so much so that, he's fought for them. But in that context, he also knows that there have been Christians, faithful people, faithful to the church, who have kind of done their own thing, like Cardinal Jimenez. And he would have heard of Cardinal Jimenez, clearly. So he knows it's not just, kind of getting in lockstep with a bunch of people and, marching without thinking, which, as you'll see, is very important to Loyola. And I also think that culture of print that was already taking place in Spain was important. And maybe the difference between their personalities or their professions. I mean, on the one hand, we have Luther, who was a teacher and a monk and a very anxious person. And then we've got Loyola, who was a soldier. Very different. They came from very different places. So I think some people would probably just point to personalities, but I think really their context, both culturally and geographically in Spain, probably had Loyola's had much to do with Loyola deciding to stay in the church. So he did go to Jerusalem, but the Franciscans there, who were in charge of all the holy places, refused to let him stay. So people were kind of proprietary. Here they have this, and you don't know what of his personality he took with him still. If he marched in and said, "Hello, my name is Inigo, da-da-da-da, I'm here to stay and help you," they might have said, "You can go back to Spain, really. We don't need you here." So he went back to Spain, let's see where we are, and went to school. And this will be an interesting theme that runs through Spanish Reformation history, but also through Loyola's personal life and through the Jesuits, which he founded later. He went to school for 10 years. He went to back to Barcelona, started learning Latin, then went back up to Toledo to the university that Cardinal Jimenez had started, then went to another university and just kept learning. But along the way, he had trouble with the Inquisition. In fact, he was one that was threatened with capital punishment. They did not like what they were hearing from this guy. Why? He'd started thinking. He was doing new things. It was a little too different. So I've got on the left there what people were worried about. And one thing, especially in Spain at this time, was this group called the Alumbrados, or Illuminists. And a lot of them were Jewish converts. Now, we don't know, some of them were probably very sincere, others probably weren't. Converts were also called new Christians. And because they were new, they were suspect. the old church that had been there for centuries was very suspicious of anything new and innovative. And these folks were new and innovative. And in fact, that was really the same charge that the church leveled against Luther and all of the reformers and the Protestant reformers. They were innovators, and we don't want innovation. We need consistency and tradition. Yes, we can grow and change a little bit, but we can't innovate. That's too much. So they read, part of what was new was they read devotional literature privately and advocated private meditative prayer. Now, think, that's quiet. So if you even just think about how people, when they first started reading, they read out loud. Well, you can't tell what somebody's thinking if they're just thinking their thoughts in their head, you know? You need to hear it so that everybody knows what's going on. So this really was not the done thing, and it was suspicious, and so they were looked at as deviant. And the Inquisition in Spain thought that Loyola was probably an Illuminist, and they were not going to have that. So he spent some time in jail. So when he got out, he left Spain and to get away from the Inquisition, so that seems like a reasonable decision. And he finished his education in Paris. So by the time he finished, it was 10 years. And along the way, he met some friends with whom he would later form the Society of Jesus, what we now call the Jesuits. And in Paris, in 1534, they made a vow together to go back to Jerusalem. Now, this is a different kind of thing. We can see the movement in Christian history because they're not going back. They decide not to go back to fight the Muslims. They want to go back to convert them. They want to go and do evangelism in Jerusalem with the Muslims. Also interesting at that time. So they made a vow that they would do that, and if that didn't work, they'd go to Rome and put themselves at the disposal of the Pope. Well, it didn't work. They went to Rome, and this he said when he got to Rome, he said that it was exceedingly barren of good fruit and abundant in bad. So you can think of Luther too, and another similarity with Luther. Luther went to Rome, you remember, and just was appalled at the horrific abuses of people and power and spirituality that were happening in Rome. And Loyola had the same experience. And in fact, he and his companions also had a difficult time. They were still looked at suspiciously until they got support from a kind of a reforming cardinal and then from Pope Paul III himself. So then in 1540, the Society of Jesus was established by a papal bull. And so it became an approved religious order. They didn't have to worry anymore about the Inquisition. They had their note from the Pope. They could take it home or wherever they went. They were good to go. So here's where you see the biggest difference between Luther and Loyola. Unlike Luther, who completely broke with the papacy, Loyola actually tied his order to it. They served at the Pope's discretion, at his leisure. They were working directly for the Pope, which in the long run is going to also, later on, centuries down the road, get them in trouble because the Pope's in Rome and they are often not. And so who's to say? But for the time being, they were good to go because they were under the Pope's protection, so to speak. So things were bad in Rome, but things were looking up, and the Society of Jesus took off. It started in 1540 with just that handful of guys that had gotten to be pals. In 15 years, they had 300 members, In 50 years, they had over 2,000. So this was an amazing takeoff of a new religious order that was clearly meeting people's needs. It was doing something within the Catholic Church that hadn't been done before. So what were the Jesuits doing? They were preaching, they were teaching, instructing children, they were hearing confessions, and we'll hear in a minute that hearing confessions and penance got to be even more important. Then they were also giving the spiritual exercises that Ignatius had developed. And so that's what I want to talk about. And Ellie, the point of the spiritual exercises was to find God in all things. So we've got a couple copies. Those are just pass the paperbacks around. Ellie, if you would start one over here and one over here. This is how Ignatius described, this is a quote from Teilhard de Chardin. God is not remote from us. He is at the point of my pen, my pick, my paintbrush, my needle, and my heart and my thoughts. So Loyola is going to tap into this really, the immanence, the closeness of God that he found in Christ. And he's going to do it in a very personal way. In some ways, I have to think that if Loyola and Wesley sat down and had coffee, they would have a lot in common and they would get along really well. And they'd go, oh yeah, I talked about that this way. My heart was strangely warmed. And Loyola would say, well, I saw it in the saints' lives. The saints' lives did amazing things for God. And Wesley would say, yes, and then we went out. And Loyola would say, yes, and we went out. So it's a very interesting parallel kind of personal faith that Loyola is developing, but within the church, This is how Ignatius described the spiritual exercises. By the term spiritual exercises is meant every method of examination of conscience and meditation, of contemplation, of vocal and mental prayer, and of other spiritual activities. We call spiritual exercises every way of preparing and disposing the soul to rid itself of all inordinate attachments, read sin, and after their removal, of seeking and finding the will of God in the disposition of our life for the salvation of our soul. So remember last week we talked about how Wesley was just, one step at a time on earth, could be becoming more and more sanctified, more and more perfect, as much as possible on earth. This is the same kind of thing, but Ignatius is spelling this out for us, how we're going to do it. Interestingly, the exercises aren't really a book that you sit down and read. And you can tell just by opening them up. But they're really to be practiced. They're practices that should be undertaken under the direction of someone more experienced. And I have to tell you, yesterday I was at the Huntington, and when I left to go home, I ran into a friend of ours. Her name's Susan Rigby. And and she said, oh, and guess what? Now I'm learning to direct people in Loyola's spiritual exercises. I finished my spiritual direction course, and now I'm working with the Catholics to learn how to practice and lead other people to practice these exercises. And I was like, wow, that was really timely. Thank you, Susan. And I know that aren't you guys doing that? Yeah, I may have you come up like after the beginning and say something. After the break. We've got a couple of people who are actually being led through the spiritual exercises right now. I've never done them personally, but here's how they're structured. They're 4 weeks of practices, things to do, things to think about, really, not so much do right at the moment. The first week, it's a time of reflection on your life in light of God's love. And you see that our response to God's love is hindered by sin. And so you come to face those sins and understand everything that gets in the way of a loving response to God. Now, these are not 7-day weeks. You know, you might be really good at the first week, so that would take 4 days. And then the next week you go, whoa, this is going to take me the rest of my life. The second week, teach us how to follow Christ as his disciples, reflecting on scripture passages. And it's interesting because imagine yourself in a passage, actually. Third week, they meditate on Christ, on Easter week, on the Last Supper, the crucifixion, his death, and his suffering, and come to understand that as really the ultimate expression, as of course it is, of God's love. And then the last week is on, the meditations are on Jesus' resurrection and his appearances to the disciples. We walk with the risen Christ and set out to love and serve him in concrete ways in our lives in the world. We are going to leave the Jesuits here because we will encounter them greatly in 2 weeks when we finish our time together with the Reformation going out into the world. And along with the Moravians, or in addition to the Moravians that we learned about last week, the Jesuits go out, amazingly out into the world. And so this is not just meditating in your head, you know, and then just getting up and going about your business. This is really meditating on the life of Christ in order to understand what change should take place in your life and what you should do about it. And so the Jesuits historically have gone out. So we will leave the Jesuits there. And you know what? I think that I'll tell you, we'll get caught up here with where we are, and then we'll take a break and come back for the Council of Trent. A little further on, so the Jesuits formed with the Pope's permission in 1540. A couple of years later, John of the Cross comes into the world, and we'll hear a little bit more about him after the break. Also, the Council of Trent. This is the council that Luther was begging the church to call until he didn't anymore. But he wanted there to be a council to talk about the abuses in the church and figure out how to change it. Finally, Pope Paul, the one that gave Ignatius his permission, called the Council of Trent. At the same time, this is just so we have an idea of where we are historically, Mary is ruling in England. And then right at the middle of the century, Loyola himself dies of malaria in Rome. And it's really interesting because with all of his folks, his brothers, going out into the world, Loyola actually never left Rome again because they needed somebody to be in charge and figure out how this was all going to work. And so it turned out that he was the one. And I have to wonder if he wasn't a little disappointed, because he was the one that kept wanting to go to Jerusalem and do the evangelism of the Muslims. And he didn't get to. He remained in Rome and then died of malaria. Another really interesting parallel with Luther. I mean, they both, not that Luther died of malaria, but they both died in their beds. They did not, in spite of the amazing opposition to their idea of reform, of the church, and of their idea of Christians learning and becoming more personally related to God in that kind of personal faith, they both died at home in spite of all that persecution. So let's take a break and come back, 10 after or so, and we'll go on to the Council of Trent and what happened after that. And we're going to see, last week we did music, this week we're going to do art. This is, really, I do think that God cares about us quite a lot. And because I teach, I get to see it sometimes just in the way things come together. So running into my friend yesterday and knowing that these guys have done the Ignatian exercises, whereas I haven't ever. So Paul and Joyce, sorry. I want you to be Gloria because you're so, yes, exactly. Paul and Joyce have practiced these exercises, and I asked them to. Joyce just told me beautifully at the break what they've meant to her. So I'm going to just turn the microphone over to you guys.
Trouble is, my short-term memory is no good. So
I can't
remember what I told you. Is this on?
Is it? Are we on? Is it okay?
Well, this has just been an exciting thing for me. It's a daily thing. I will confess the last week or two, there's been some other things that I haven't been doing it, as thoughtfully as I should be. But it's a very simple time of bringing yourself to a certain place every day and placing yourself in God's presence. And it's just a joyful time of giving thanks to Him for His love for us. It has a text to follow. You read the text. And then you pray a simple prayer from your heart to just ask God to help you understand how He's acting in your life. It's here on your paper. Then you kind of review your day. And you recall specific moments, this says, in your feelings, which is a good thing for all of us. It may be a hard day that's facing us, or we've had some things that are difficult, and we're having to kind of bring those to the Lord. The reflecting on what you did, said, or thought in those instances. The very first lesson that I did was taking me back, saying, when do you remember truly being loved? And this whole Ignatius exercise is based on how can you take this love that you've learned and can remember back, recall, and connect with, and pull that back into your life so that Jesus is not just a heady word in your life or an experience that you had some years ago at camp or wherever, but that He is now becoming your personal go-to in a way that's almost childlike, and I think that's why I love it. And so that was a real experience of spending. I was telling Becky, I had to sit there for, I couldn't tell you, 30 minutes thinking, there were so many places I felt loved, but where did I as a child first feel really unconditionally loved? I just took my family out of it. I wanted to go beyond that. And that was a very wonderful, actually, it took me back to my third grade teacher, Mrs. Sally Potter. You know how you'll remember those things. Never will forget her and how she loved me and saw that I had a little artistic ability that I never went on to do much with. But anyway, this was a real time of just bringing you back to your childhood and then bringing you up to now, and then looking forward to tomorrow is a big one. How can I take this text? How can I take all that you have given me this morning, this afternoon, whenever I'm doing this exercise? How can I take this to my neighbor next door, to a person who calls me on the phone, or to my husband, to my family? So it's a wonderful experience, and I hope we can implement this in the church.
Yeah, we took a 6 weeks course using a book about this thick from Melbourne, Australia. A priest down there put it together, and it's 4 retreats. It's best, of course, doing it in a group like this, and it's all about self-inquiry. What's going on in my mind that's making me have a good spirit? What's going on in my mind that's making me have a bad spirit? Those are the terms they use. A good spirit is feeling loving and joyful and waking up with a song in my heart. Feeling a bad spirit is, a little down today. And then how it's the first 16th century, first psychological, in-depth, through meditation, through Bible study, through self-inquiry, through all the best that 21st century psychology is barely catching up with. It's just awesome.
Thank you guys so much. Oops. Yeah, so let me just go back to the question that I put up at the beginning. If Reformation is the answer, what is the question? And the question really is, how can people be closer to God? How can people understand the presence of God in their lives, in their world, in their jobs? And so both sides of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Reformation, got at these kinds of things in very similar ways, but in different places, in different contexts. And of course, when we think back to that second week where we talked about the politics that are involved, when we look back and think about history, that kind of gunks everything up. But I think if we look at the practices, so Ignatius saying, well, what makes you feel joyful and what makes you feel sad is so akin to Luther's encouragement of his barber, who, he thought maybe to be closer to God, he needed to be a priest. And Luther said, you don't have to be a priest. You be a barber. Be a barber to the glory of God. Be the best barber that you can be. And so we see this, the Word of God really seeping into people's lives. And that's what the Reformation was the answer to. Yes, there was national and there was political and there was institutional, religious sorts of things going on. But I really think in these times in history where we see the Holy Spirit working, it doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox. We hear God's Spirit speaking to us and we respond. And that's what we see here clearly with Loyola and in ways that have continued till 3 seconds ago. So let me just get us caught back up here. As I said, Reform was in the air finally in Rome, and Pope Paul III called the Council of Trent finally. There it is. Trent's up in the northern part of Italy. This is what he said he wanted to happen at the council. He wanted the council to ponder, discuss, execute, and bring speedily and happily to the desired result whatever things pertain to the purity and truth of the Christian religion. The purity and truth of the Christian religion, to the restoration of what is good and the correction of bad morals, to the peace, unity, and harmony of Christians among themselves, of the princes as well as the people. So when Trent was called, they were still really hopeful that the church could come back together. That was one of their goals. They wanted the church to be reunified. And so he says, he talks directly to the politics of it, to the princes as well as the people. There they are as a depiction of what the council would have looked like. It was the longest council ever, 18 years from start to finish. They didn't sit 18 years. It kept getting broken up. Why did it get broken up? I know. Can you imagine a committee meeting for 18 years?
I've been in a bunch of them.
Yeah, I don't know if church committees or faculty committees are worse. Anyway, it didn't last 18 continuous years. It was in 3 sessions. First one was 4 years, then there was 2 years, and then a final 2 years. And let me give you just an idea of the kinds of things that they talked about. The very first session, they went straight on, they waded right in, and they talked about, is salvation by faith alone? Is justification by faith alone? Sola fide. They said, no. Then they also affirmed purgatory and indulgences. Remember indulgences? That was what really got Luther going. You could pay for somebody to get out of purgatory. They said, okay, that's not that good. We think you're right. You shouldn't be paying. But Peter is and the Pope are in charge of the church. We have this bank of merit, and we can distribute it to people that we think deserve it. So we're not giving that up. No, you can't pay for your indulgence, but we're keeping the doctrine. And like Cardinal Jimenez in Spain with the priests, they said bishops must live in their diocese. So again, if you were a bishop, sometimes it was an honorific and a benefice. You got money for being from all the tithes that were collected. But those were your people. So if your diocese is in northwestern Iowa where there's nothing but cows and corn, you got to go live in northwestern Iowa. You can't be living in Chicago, okay? So I lived in northwestern Iowa. I know that of which I speak. So that was their first session. The second session, they thought to invite the Protestants. Oh, if we're gonna reunify, if we're gonna unify the church, maybe we should ask them to come. Well, it was a little not enough and too late. So the Protestants said, well, yeah, maybe, but we don't want to go before a church council. We want to go before judges from the state. So the Protestants really had already separated. And they realized it was at that session that this really probably wasn't going to happen. There was a whole bunch of interesting to us now details, but really crazily difficult details like safe conducts. So the Protestants would have all had to have a safe conduct, a piece of paper from the Pope that allowed them to travel through all the territories that were probably Catholic or at least not their brand of Protestant to get themselves safely to Trent. And that was a detail that was problematic. And then finally, in the third session, they discussed communion. If you remember at this time, it was also one of the things that the Protestants were very upset about. They thought that everyone should be able to have communion in both kinds. That is, they should be able to have the bread and the cup. Whereas the Catholics, the laity just got the bread. And Trent said, no, only priests get the cup and the bread, not the laity. They said that the Mass was indeed a true sacrifice, but they realized, and here's the reform part, they did realize that there were some legitimate objections to what was going on. So again, like Cardinal Jimenez, good 50 years earlier, they said the clergy had to be trained. They had to know something. So many seminaries were started. And they had, the clergy had to have better standards of morality. So some of those things that Cardinal Jimenez had begun in Spain much earlier, the Council of Trent sort of ratified. It's interesting that there was no statement, not an overarching statement about the nature of the papacy or the extent of papal power, because it was almost too much of a hot button. So even all of these cardinals coming together couldn't bring themselves to actually write in, a succinct paragraph the kind of power and authority that the Pope had. They did try to make the church more centralized in that things would, they had cardinals, there was a hierarchical structure, and that was centered in Rome. But the objection to that, as you might imagine, was some of these national governments that were coming into play. So the King of France not only didn't like the King of Spain, he didn't like the idea that all the power of the church would be in Rome with the Pope. And so there's still tension going on between the secular arm of government and the religious arm of government. And so in some of the things, they couldn't come to an agreement, and some of them they didn't even talk about. Interestingly, I read somewhere that said the Counter-Reformation, what I grew up understanding as the Counter-Reformation, which I think really is better to call the Catholic Reformation, the Holy Spirit's reformation of the church, wasn't completed in terms of all the things that they needed to talk about until Vatican II in the 60s, which is not to say that the church is reformed, because like us Presbyterians, the Catholics also believe that the church is always to be reformed, semper reformanda, to be reformed, passive, by the Holy Spirit and God. So not to say that the church is reformed, it never will be, but that that in Vatican II, they finally crossed the T's and dotted the I's that were begun, hundreds of years before. So what does all this mean? We're going to skip that. What does all this mean to just us ordinary folks? Well, post-Trent, the hierarchy was determined to impose a kind of a level of conformity. They wanted people to look the same. Now, they were going to say what was allowed. So the Ignatian spiritual exercises are allowed, and some of these things were allowed. But what's allowed has to be said by us, and we're going to say what it needs to look like. So they want to have some conformity and discipline. And so they have some goals for the laity. And it's interesting to know what in Spain was the case before Trent. Before Trent, if you went to church, which you didn't necessarily go to Mass every Sunday at all, but if you went, you walked in the church, there would be a parchment, like a letter, stuck somewhere up on the wall of the church. And it had the 10 Commandments, the Creed, a list of the 7 sacraments, the mortal sins, and that was to be read out loud by the priest every Sunday during Lent. That was it. So you didn't have to memorize it necessarily, but it was there in the church for reference, and the priest could get it down and hopefully read it. And you'll remember from 2 weeks ago that this was the time when the Catholic catechisms started coming into play as well. So that's as a direct result of Trent. So they wanted the laity to be more aware and really know doctrine. And it's so funny because this is hardly doctrine to me. They needed to know the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, the Ave Maria, the Salve Regina, so those are Marian hymns, and the 10 Commandments. And in fact, the 10 Commandments, they kind of worked at this gradually in 5-year increments. And the first thing was they just needed to know the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, and how to make the sign of the cross. And then about 5 years later, they added the Marian hymns. And then about 5 years after that, they added the 10 Commandments. So it was kind of like this gradual curriculum mounting. Priests were supposed to teach the catechism on the holy days after noon, and parents should help. And as you know, the catechisms were printed in the vernacular. Regular, ordinary people were also supposed to be more diligent in the practice of faith. So you were actually, in fact, supposed to go to Mass on Sunday and not work. You were supposed to take communion at least once a year, and before you did that, you needed to make confession once a year in Lent. You were supposed to observe feast days. You were supposed to be baptized and have your children baptized. And so far as we can tell, that was the thing people really did. They got their kids baptized. And this is new. They needed to be married by a priest in the church, and they had to have adequate knowledge of Christian doctrine. This was not the usual thing. Couples could just go out and say, okay, we're married. And you'd kind of go, okay. You come home and don't do that. Now the whole institution of marriage is becoming much more stable and consistent. It's supposed to happen with a priest in a church. And I don't think we could call it premarital counseling yet, but the priest is supposed to make sure you know those things, the 10 Commandments and all that. So marriage gets to be much more uniform. And death also becomes a little more uniform, if you can talk about it that way. They needed to receive extreme unction, last rites. They don't call it that anymore. But that is the sacrament that is supposed to give people strength to resist evil on their deathbed. So it's not magic. I think when I was growing up, I thought it was some sort of magical thing. And that's not it. What the belief is that it helps you when your body is tired and you're weak. And you know when you're sick, the last thing you want to do is think hard about something or fight something. And so this sacrament was understood to give you the strength that you would need. And then also you were supposed to provide for masses to be said for your soul after you died. Let me see, I just can't, see where I am in my slides. So how did they do this? In Spain, religion was tied up in all kinds of community activities. So they started also prohibiting the following things from taking place in church. Mass could take place in church, marriage, baptism, but you couldn't do business in church, in the church building. You couldn't have a fair, you couldn't have a market, you couldn't have the town council meeting, and you could not eat or drink. So lucky you guys are in the parish hall and not in church, because you'd be in real trouble if you were in Spain at this time. And it's interesting because the way it worked in Spain was the church instructed and the Inquisition corrected. So by this time, after the Council of Trent, we're in the middle of the 16th century, most of the Muslims and Jews in Spain have either converted or left. Now, what the Spanish Inquisition is going to worry about is what they called the old Christians. And that was just like everybody else. So they made sure that these things were followed. And if they weren't, you could be hauled in front of the Inquisition. Now, this is not like a government office. So it's not like we have to go to the passport office in West LA to go in front of the Inquisition. They would come right to you. So don't worry about it. And it was very intimidating. I didn't think it was that funny. But it would be a local thing. And again, the scary part was that your neighbors knew you. Think now. Did you take your garbage cans in right after the truck came and picked them up, or did you leave them out? These are the kinds of things your neighbors know about you. Same kind of thing, only religious at this time period.
Mow your lawn on Sunday.
Oh, right, yeah. Where Lee and I lived in, when I was talking about northwestern Iowa, we lived in a tiny town in northwestern Iowa called Orange City. We worked at a college called Northwestern, which was really great because we met each other there. But it was also kind of hard because the place is full of Dutch Calvinists. This is how I know about Dutch Calvinism. And let me just tell you something. Don't be mowing your lawn on Sunday. Just don't. Because I tell you, Mrs. DeVries next door, she'll talk to you about it on Monday. So I remember right before we were moving out here to California, we were moving from we had a house in Iowa, we were going to move to an apartment, and I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do without a garage and the driveway to do all my projects in? So I had all these projects to do before we left Iowa and got to an apartment. So I was painting this rocking chair, and I hid, because I had to do it on Sunday. It was the only time. And there was this little place that you could kind of, in between the garage and the house, that you couldn't see if you got in there just right. So I went back in there on Sunday and got my blue paint with my rocker, and I painted my rocking chair so that this wonderful woman who lived next door to us, but she would have talked to me about it because she was concerned about me, not because she was mean or picky. She loved me. And in fact, their family, when we moved to California and our house didn't sell right away, we decided to rent it. They took care of our house for us and maintained it and helped the renters when we needed it. So it was because they cared about people, and they really thought, God, we need to keep Sunday holy. This is one of the 10 Commandments. And so if you're not doing that, Becky, I care about you. But I wanted my rocker painted, so I need to do those Ignatian exercises. Clearly, I have things I need to go back and work through. Anyway, so you can imagine they had problems. Some of the areas, like Orange City, Iowa, there was rural areas, and they, in spite of the willingness of the Inquisition to come, they just couldn't get to everywhere. And sometimes the people just were recalcitrant, as people sometimes are. And so I learned this, that sometimes it has happened, this is a report, sometimes it has happened that when priests or preachers are rebuking of or speaking ill of vices or sins of the people, the persons referred to or those that claim authority in the town stand up and reply to the priest, and at times speak words that are rude, indecent, and unworthy of such a place. So just imagine, I'm up here and I'm saying I'm preaching on let's just say, thou shalt not, keep the Sabbath holy. And I say, Eatons, you put your garbage out on Sunday, didn't you? You shouldn't be doing that. And Phil stands up and says, gosh darn it all, Becky, stop it. It's like it was a back and forth. So, it's people. What are you going to do with people? Who knows? Anyway. But one of the positive ways that they encourage this, now we're talking about all this negative. One of the positive ways, though, was to encourage legitimate veneration of saints whose lives and works might work as good examples for people. So it's not just all negative, it's positive as well. So here's what I want to, we'll finish up. I want to tell you about a couple saints and then show you some artwork that they also encouraged at this time. The first, this guy's name is Philip Neri, and he also, Marilyn isn't here. He was also a small group guy. He gathered the laity informally for prayer, discussion, and recreation. So now just think, this is young life in Rome in the 16th century. That was his way of encouraging people to be part of the church more fully and wholly and for real. So he said ordinary people could live not just respectable, but sanctified lives. So again, the Reformation is the answer to this question of how do people, whoever they are, become closer and closer relationship with God. So the 16th century is called the Age of the Saints. And let me tell you, we talked a little bit about Teresa of Avila last year. She was a Carmelite nun. She started out as a Carmelite nun. She didn't have a great, warming of her heart experience before she went into the convent. She just, went to the convent because her parents told her to. She also read some books that were available. And so she embarked on what was really for her a long and difficult spiritual journey. And she's got 3 books. Let me see, did I put them? Yeah, her autobiography, The Interior Castle, and The Way of Devotion are the 3 books, and I have one here. But she felt this tension because she was reading some devotional books, just like Loyola, but her convent was really lax. So like the women could come and go and, go out and party and spend the night with their boyfriend and then come back the next day. And so she had this real struggle. And she says, I voyaged on this tempestuous sea for almost 20 years with these fallings and risings. On the one side, God called me, and on the other, I followed the world. All divine things gave me pleasure, yet those of the world held me prisoner. All divine things gave me pleasure, yet those of the world held me prisoner. Then one day, while she was walking down a hallway in the convent, she happened to look at a statue of Jesus. And she had this vision of his love that continued in spite of her rising and falling, of her inconstancy. And it pierced her heart. And she said, gently but powerfully, Jesus began to break down her defenses and reveal to her the cause of her spiritual exhaustion. That was her entertaining all of those worldly delights. And so this is Bernini's sculpture, and I have a better picture of it we'll look in a little bit. But this is Bernini's sculpture of this moment when Teresa's heart is pierced. So it was her heart strangely warmed in a different way than Wesley's. But so she renounced sin and she started having mystical experiences, visions, and she dedicated herself to reform, especially to reform her order, the Carmelites. So she took to the roads. This was also not a done thing. And yes, she got hauled up in front of the Inquisition. She was accused of spreading superstition, of influencing those Illuminati in Seville, and of being Jewish. And actually, as it turned out, her paternal grandfather was Jewish. He was a new Christian in Toledo. But they were really worried because, like Ignatius, who also did this, she allowed Jewish converts to join the Carmelites. And they were welcome also in the Jesuits. So that was a little dicey even still. It became a little bit, the Inquisition got less and less repressive as time went on, which probably makes sense, but also because I think Trent gave it a little more direction. Before it was like, well, I think it's really bad if you eat M&Ms on Sunday, but that other inquisitor thinks M&Ms with peanuts are okay because there's protein. I don't know. So it got a little more even, and so actually got a little bit less horrifying. So after that, Teresa's spirituality was also recognized as an aid to Catholic reform rather than a threat. So same thing with Ignatius and with Teresa. Another Spanish mystic was John of the Cross. He was educated first. He's younger. He went to a Jesuit school. So now we're starting to have a second generation. He went to Jesuits, then he went to the same university in Spain that Loyola went to, and then he met Teresa of Avila, who persuaded him to join her and reform the Carmelites. Well, this was not so much by the Inquisition, but he got kidnapped and held for 6 months in a 6 by 10 foot cell. He couldn't stand up in it. And it was in this dark time, by the light, there was a tiny hole in the wall. He wrote the poem that we all know him for, The Dark Night of the Soul. And let me just read a little bit of it for you. One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, the sheer grace. I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. In darkness and secure, by the secret ladder disguised. The sheer grace. In darkness and concealment, my house being now all stilled. On that glad night in secret, for no one saw me, nor did I look at anything, with no other light or guide than the one that burned in my heart. This guided me more surely than the light of noon, to where he was awaiting me. Him I knew so well, there in a place where no one appeared. O guiding night, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that has united the lover with his beloved, transforming the beloved in her lover. So you see now this mystical part of the Spanish Reformation is not just having their hearts strangely warmed, they are becoming one with Jesus. That's how close and how personal this reform is, and how deeply these saints are feeling the love of Christ for themselves, that the only way they can think to express it is in the language of a lover and the beloved. So beautifully put. It turned out that John of the Cross escaped, and he spent the next year recuperating and writing a book called Ascent of the Soul, which explained, it took a whole book to explain the poetry that he had written in the confines of this dark cell. But now we know him through just the phrase dark night of the soul. But that's where it comes from. When we talk about dark night of the soul, when anybody's undergoing a really, really difficult time, when you just simply cannot see any light. And what John of the Cross said is that's the time when we can really know. We have to really give ourselves over to knowing, even though we cannot see, because it's so dark, knowing that God is there with us. So he said these things: the endurance of darkness is the preparation for great light. And so he's thinking of the light of heaven. The endurance of darkness is the preparation for great light. And then here again, and you can see how this would be suspect with the church and the Inquisition at the time. Who teaches the soul if not God? This is really direct. This is not mediated by the church. And yet somehow, in the context of these Spanish mystics, the church embraced this mysticism. And so in 1620, here, I'm just going to tell you, in 1622, both Ignatius and Teresa of Avila were canonized and made saints. So this is less than 100 years after their deaths. So the church has so fully embraced them that they are venerating them. So let me just go back to this one, just so you know where we are in time. 1622, in the context of Spain, they're being canonized, but we're also in the midst of the 30 Years' War back on the main continent. So that's where we are. And Elizabeth has been queen in England. I've put Rubens and Bernini up here because art was also a way that the church encouraged the people to learn and understand how to be in a relationship with God. I have to tell you, up until this past week, I really, really disliked Baroque art. I'm getting a little fonder of it. It always just seemed to me so much. It's a lot. Much. But there was a reason for that. It was strong and it was solid, and it focused on acceptable saints, Catholic saints, the Virgin Mary, and how to live rightly. And here's a perfect example. And I'll bet you never would have thought the burial of the Count of Orgaz would have been the perfect example, but it is. This is a painting by El Greco. And what you see in it are, down there at the bottom, you can see, you can barely see the Count on his deathbed. But he's surrounded, as he should have been, in a well-ordered society by members of the clergy. And look, if you look on the far left, that's probably a Dominican or a Franciscan, judging from the habit. But it's a what we would call a regular religious, which means they go by a rule, which in Latin is regula. So it's really funny if you're a monk or a nun or a Franciscan or a Dominican, you're called a regular religious. The guy on the right side in the white with the little black, he's just a parish priest. He's a diocesan priest. He's not regular, he's diocesan, okay? So there's a difference. But if you've been the kind of Christian that you should have been at your death, both of those parts of the church will come together to support your family and pray for you. as will all of your colleagues in the town council or in your guild or whatever it is. So you can see in the background all of those, I think they're mostly men, and they would have been, surrounding the count with their prayers. But then you see what's going on in the heavens, and who is in the heavens that is very important is Mary. Mary, do you see Mary with the blue and the red? And then all the saints around. This is depicting the moment of death and the connection between heaven and earth and heaven, I should say. So in heaven, the heavens are opening up, and the saints and Mary are welcoming the count because he's lived a good life. So you're supposed to be, if you see this image, you should think, I could and should be like the count. And this is how I need to live my life so that at the point of death, these things will come together. All the parts of the church, all the parts of the community, as well as the community of heaven. This is a great one, and I'll put this up when we're done so you can come and look. This is a Rubens. It's called The Elevation of the Cross. It was done, he painted it in 1610. It is not, this is in Antwerp at the Cathedral of Our Lady, but it's not where it was originally intended. That church burned. But what is so typical and important and crucial for this time with this painting is the sheer physicality of it. It is an altarpiece. It would not have, it looks kind of dwarfs the altar that it's behind right now. But they think that originally there would have been an image of God the Father above. So Jesus would have been looking up to God the Father. But this is so incredibly physical. If you look at it up close, it's almost like you could go in and be part of that painting and help those guys lift the cross because their bodies are straining. So what you realize is that the crucifixion of Jesus was an incredibly physical, real incident. It happened, and it was big. It was a big thing. And in the connection with the Catholic Reform at Trent, what they've made clear is in communion, in the Eucharist, the belief is that Jesus is truly present, that the bread and the wine are changed into his body and blood. So right there at the altar where you are going to receive the bread anyway, you see Christ's physical body. And so this is also one of a message that is being communicated about what you are to believe at this time, that Jesus is physically present in the elements of the Eucharist. And you can see that because right there he is, really big, right above the altar. The other part about, I want to show you the left wing of this triptych, is you see at the top, kind of the top right, it's John and Mary, and it's at the time Jesus, you know how paintings bring time together. Jesus is going to say to John and Mary, behold your mother, behold your son. So there they are. But what is crucial at this time about this is that Mary is standing. So it's the Stabat Mater, the mother, the standing mother. Mother is standing. Stands, mother stands. And it was very important because at this time, Mary was understood to be a very strong woman. She outlived her son. She took him from cradle to grave. And she was with the apostles in the upper room at Pentecost, and she was, in fact, the first apostle. And given all that, we cannot have a Mary at the foot of the cross in a puddle of tears. This just is not appropriate. Mary is standing, she is strong, she is faithful, she knows that she has loved her son and he loves her. She doesn't know how this is going to turn out at this moment, but she has faith. She is the first disciple with the greatest faith. And so to depict Mary at this time, it became crucial that she be depicted as a strong, standing woman, not as a person who, just fell apart. Here, who's seen this? Who's been to the Norton Simon? This painting is right down at the Norton Simon, which is why I put it in here. So if you go down there, it's really close to the entrance. It is huge. It's ginormous. It's way bigger than you are. And you look up and you go, oh my gosh, how did he do that? That's huge. And again, this is another Rubens. This is Ignatius of Loyola. And this you'll contrast with Jimenez's outfit. Remember how I said this is just a little fancier. And Jimenez didn't want to be, he wanted to be a simple Franciscan. But Rubens has portrayed Ignatius as bigger than life, which is what he was, and as a saint that we can follow is bigger than life. And how what Ignatius has right there are the exercises. So Rubens is putting all this in as a person that we can follow. The church has now said he's okay. And now, Ellie, if you'd pass this around, at about this time, and we'll just we can stay a while and let people look at this. This is a life of Saint Ignatius in pictures. It's a picture book from this period of time, and the pictures are from woodcuts. So they look a lot more like the kinds of art we're used to seeing in association with Luther, some of those German woodcuts. But they show his whole life story, and each page has a picture and a little inscription. So it's very interesting how we are supposed to follow these saints. And again, Mary was very important. And so here is another Rubens focusing again on the time of death, but here Mary's death, which was not death. It was assumption into heaven. And so we see her going in all glory, accompanied by angels and by people who understand what's happening. And then we have Bernini. Here is the ecstasy of Saint Teresa that I showed you the part on the left before. It's interesting because all of that light that was so important both to Teresa and to John of the Cross, the Carmelites, you see that coming down in the architecture where the sculpture is placed. But then you see her pierced by the love. It reminds me of that passage in Augustine. I was pierced by your word, right, Lee? But I was pierced by your word, Augustine.
Yeah,
my heart.
You pierced my heart with your word, and I fell in love with you.
Yeah, you pierced my heart with your word, and I fell in love with you. And so in some ways, Teresa's life is reflective of an earlier saint. And here again, we see this depicted in a way that really is almost erotic. I mean, the closeness of Jesus to these saints was that of lover and beloved, like in the Song of Solomon. And then finally, our last pictures of St. Peter's. And Bernini also designed that piazza. So if you look at it from this angle, that the round part where it goes out like this is the arms of the church, the mother's arms of the church embracing all of the people who will gather in there. So this was another way in architecture of communicating this reform, how people could become closer to God in whatever ways. Obviously, not everybody took the church up on those offers. Some people left. Some people had crazy ideas like Minocchio, the cheese and the worms. And other people, were Sunday Christians or whatever. But some people really did, through all of this, the Catholic side of this reform, ask the question, how can we make this a living faith? And I think this is really a lovely image of the church reaching out to embrace the people who will come into her. All right, questions. And I'm supposed to say, if you have questions, please use that microphone. And I'm also happy to just wait because it's time to go. So if anybody has questions, I can stay. Ellie, do you have?
No, I was just going to say, do you want me to pass around the microphone? Like, do you want to do this?
Oh, not if anybody, raise your hand high if you have a question. All right. Well, if not, next week will be fun, and we'll figure out the connection with food and wine and Spain and reform. And yes, that will be fun. And then our last time together will be the next week, and we'll talk about everybody who went out into the world. Great. Thank you again for coming. Thank you.